Thank you, Professor Rosales, for such a warm welcome, and thank you all for being here. Again, this is my book, To March for Others, The Black Freedom Struggle and the United Farm Workers. So I want to begin by just talking about what I set out to do in conducting this research and writing this book. So I was basically trying to challenge two dominant scholarly narratives. The first being the dominant narrative of the Civil Rights Movement, that it was a struggle of African Americans fighting to dismantle Jim Crow racism and segregation in the South. But I was also seeking to challenge the dominant narrative of the United Farm Workers and the Chicano movement, that of Mexican Americans rising up in opposition to racial discrimination and economic inequality throughout the Southwest. So in both of these narratives, the foes have been the same. The foes have been white. Law enforcement attacking peaceful demonstrators and picketers, landowners depriving African American and Mexican American agricultural workers of fair pay, teachers and administrators preventing black and brown children from getting an adequate education, business owners displaying signs that proclaimed white trade only or no Mexicans or dogs allowed. But also in these narratives, the allies of African Americans and Mexican Americans have also been white. College students, activists from the New Left, Catholic priests, union organizers. The domination of the South in the scholarship on the Black freedom struggle also obscures the unique and dynamic history of movements for social change in California and the rest of the West, a region of remarkable racial and ethnic diversity. So although scholars have recently started to challenge the dominant narrative of the Black freedom struggle by shedding light on civil rights activism in the North, the biracial paradigm that frames the struggle in terms of black and white generally remains intact. So what I and some of my colleagues have asked is, what happens when we decenter whiteness? How do African Americans and Latinos understand each other's struggles? At what points do the Black freedom struggle and the Chicano movement intersect? As you know, the scholarship on the Black freedom struggle is extensive, and the scholarship on the Chicano movement is in a period of proliferation. But usually this scholarship tends to examine each movement in isolation, as if each was an island, completely separate from other movements of the same period. In reality, the movements of the post-war era were marked by continuous interaction and dynamic exchange between activists. Sometimes the strategies, philosophies, and accomplishment of one movement merely influenced the others, but in other instances, movements physically intersected. Participants overlapped, resources were shared, and efforts were merged to more effectively combat a shared enemy. So this approach that other scholars have used of studying each movement individually also distorts the perspectives of the participants themselves. Quite simply, activists didn't think of themselves as participants in individual movements. They didn't describe themselves as being part of the Civil Rights Movement, or the Chicano movement, or the Red Power movement. Instead, they envisioned themselves and their struggles as part of what they called the movement, the umbrella term for the various struggles for equality and justice that unfolded in the United States from the 1950s to the 1970s. So activists had a broader view of themselves and their causes than is currently acknowledged by scholars. So my work, and that of some of my colleagues, seeks to analyze the Black freedom struggle and the Chicano movement, not just comparatively, but relationally. And so in doing so, I'm attempting to provide a more expansive perspective on each movement. Now again, there are a few of us who are doing this kind of work, but much of the existing work on the history of Black-Brown relations has fallen to two different paradigms, either a conflict paradigm or a cooperation paradigm. So that is, some argue that African Americans and Mexican Americans have historically been at odds due to competition for limited resources and their own racial and ethnic biases. Others have argued that due to their mutual struggles as people of color, African Americans and Mexican Americans are natural allies. So my aim, as I present in my book, was not to argue for either the conflict or the cooperation perspective. Rather, I sought to analyze why and how people of differing races, cultures, and struggles came together in the pursuit of social change. At the same time, I sought to understand the forces that could potentially keep them apart. So to do so, I chose 5 of the major civil rights organizations of the post-war period: the NAACP, the National Urban League, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party. Not only were these organizations at the forefront of the Black freedom struggle, but they all actively supported the UFW and its struggle. I therefore used their relationships with the UFW as a lens through which to examine approaches to multi-coalition building within the Black freedom struggle. And I argue that relations between the Black freedom struggle and the Chicano movement, and more broadly between African Americans and Mexican Americans, cannot be reduced to cross-racial solidarity or interracial conflict. Rather, multiracial coalition building is complex and multidimensional, reflective of key aspects of personal and group identity, including race, class, and geography, but aspects of each organization's identity, particularly ideology, praxis, the historical context in which it operated, and its leadership were all also instrumental in the development and outcome of coalitions. So what I would like to do now is to use the California grape boycott as an example to illustrate the points that I make in my book. So just to briefly refresh, the UFW launched its nationwide boycott of California grapes in 1968. In late 1967, the UFW had declared a strike and boycotts of the Jimara Vineyard Corporation, one of the largest table grape growers in Delano, for refusing the union's repeated requests for elections for union representation of its workers. From the beginning, the boycott was challenging because consumers were having difficulty identifying Jimara grapes. The union's earlier targets were processors, or companies that use grapes to make other products, such as wine. But Jimara grew table grapes whose brands were not household names. Furthermore, the company had obtained the labels of 70 other growers and affixed them to their crates, which compounded the difficulty of identifying the grapes that were being boycotted. So, Dolores Huerta and Fred Ross realized that as long as consumers could not tell the difference between Jimara grapes and other grapes whose labels it was using, a boycott specifically against this company would fail. So they therefore suggested to Cesar Chavez that the UFW launch a nationwide boycott of all California table grapes, which the union did in January of 1968. The California grape boycott drew national attention, and actually international attention for the UFW, and it turned La Causa into a cause célèbre. Such disparate groups as housewives, celebrities, politicians, and activists all boycotted California grapes. And among the countless people who supported the UFW during the California grape boycott were the organizations of the Black freedom struggle. However, as I mentioned earlier, civil rights organizations had differing reasons for supporting the UFW and the grape boycott, and their level of support varied. So I'm going to discuss these 4 of these organizations. So first I'll begin with the National Urban League. Members of the National Urban League boycotted grapes. They wrote letters of protest to the company. Executive Director Whitney Young wrote about La Causa in a syndicated newspaper column. But the National Urban League is known historically as the most conservative of the civil rights organizations. And its support for the farm workers was rooted in its focus on employment as a tool for social change. So from the organization's founding in 1910, the Urban League's activities were based on the belief that decent housing and employment opportunities for African Americans could both reduce racial animosity and remedy the problems of urban living, such as crime, overcrowding, and poverty. Moreover, Whitney Young had a deep faith in organized labor. From early in the organization's history, the leadership of the National Urban League saw organized labor as a vehicle to improve both the lives of African American workers and race relations more generally. And the League maintained this confidence in organized labor despite labor's frequent discrimination against African American workers. So supporting the UFW was thus in line with the League's historical ideology. But this coalition, this alliance, this support was limited. Limited by the fact that the United Farm Workers and the National Urban League had divergent organizational practice. And that is, the Urban League sought employment opportunities for African Americans through corporate sponsorship. The United Farm Workers' goal, on the other hand, was of collective bargaining, gave workers the power and control over their own labor. The League, on the other hand, ceded that power to employers. So although the National Urban League obtained job opportunities for African Americans, it was the white managers and executives who decided who, if anyone, would be hired. So the League's support for the farm workers was restrained. Small individual acts like boycotting grapes, because they didn't want to upset the League's corporate sponsors. You see a similar dynamic with the NAACP's support for the farm workers. Like the National Urban League, the National NAACP also relied on corporate ties. Also, the NAACP had a historic aversion to direct action protest strategies. So nonviolent direct action, things like boycotts, troubled the NAACP because the dramatic nature of such protests drew the public's attention away from the association's legal endeavors. Boycotts also worried the national leadership because they were concerned with alienating allies in the business community. So this limitation, this reluctance to go further on the part of the National NAACP, the National Urban League for the Grape boycott, indicates the limitations of cross-class solidarity. The National Urban League and the national leadership of the NAACP were solidly middle class, and their class positioning rested on their ties to corporations and to white business leaders. And maintaining those ties took precedence over supporting workers, both in the UFW and in the black working class. However, the NAACP's branches were much more receptive to working with the farm workers and to using boycotts in general than the national leadership, because the local branches understood that boycotts demonstrated the collective economic power of consumers. So, for example, the strongest example of this is the West Coast NAACP branches. During the UFW's earlier boycott of liquor company Shenley Industries in 1966, the West Coast branches of the NAACP had wanted to support the farm workers, but were actually prohibited from doing so by the national office because of the association's ties to that corporation. In fact, shortly before the march from Delano to Sacramento, Shenley Industries made the largest financial contribution to the NAACP up to that time. So the West Coast NAACP branches, because it's a very bureaucratic organization where you have to get permission from the national leadership to pretty much do anything, would not allow the West Coast NAACP to support this boycott. So, but that didn't really deter the West Coast branches. Under the leadership of Regional Director Leonard H. Carter, the West Coast NAACP branches took the lead in the association's support for the UFW in their subsequent strikes. The West Coast branches issued resolutions in support of the UFW, held fundraisers for the union, conducted food and clothing drives for striking farm workers. And then Carter met with Chavez in July of 1968 and then held a press conference to publicly declare the NAACP's support of the grape boycott. So then one of the things I had to do was unpack what is the difference? What is the difference between what's happening with the branches and what's happening with the national leadership? One of my conclusions is that it was about the importance of place, right? The West Coast branch's actions on behalf of the UFW were illustrative of the regional association's history of cooperation with Mexican Americans. The pronounced racial and ethnic diversity of the West put African Americans into frequent contact with Latinos and Asian Americans. And this close contact, this close knowledge led to a recognition of commonalities, to the point where multiracial coalition building became a practical and commonplace strategy in struggles for equality in the West. And this was compounded by the fact that in the West, the African American population was small in relation to the entire region. So making strategic alliances with other minority groups essential to achieving their goals. But the national leadership of the NAACP was based in New York. Right? So although there were Latinos in New York, they were not generally Mexican American. Right? And so the national leadership, and this was also true of the National Urban League, were generally unfamiliar with the issues faced by Mexican Americans. So the West Coast Regional NAACP took the lead and really had to force the national leadership and educate the national leadership about the need to support the UFW. This issue of geography as a possible hindrance to coalition building is also seen with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. So this was the organization began and presided over by Martin Luther King Jr. And during his presidency of SCLC, he never issued a public statement in support of the UFW and did not direct SCLC members to participate in any UFW boycott. And again, this goes back to the issue of geography as divisive. The King and SCLC were generally unfamiliar with Mexican Americans and their issues because the organization's presence was generally limited to the Deep South, which in the 1960s and 70s was extremely small. So according to both the 1960 and 1970 census, Latinos made up only 0.6% of the population in Georgia, where SCLC was based. And in Alabama, where SCLC also operated, the Latino population was 0.4%. So until the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, SCLC had not addressed the issues of Mexican Americans, in part because it hadn't occurred to them to mobilize on behalf of anyone other than African Americans because they lived in a black and white world. But that doesn't mean they don't get off completely scot-free. So there are other reasons that the SCLC does not or did not support the UFW. And I have to explain this because people are always surprised by this. This is the portion of my book that made my graduate school professors like upset, like visibly upset. Still, years later, you know. There is such an urge, there's such a desire to link King and Chavez because of their shared, their prominence, their shared commitment to nonviolence. But there was a lot more than geography that divided them. So despite King's empathy for the poor and commitment to economic justice, he was largely distrustful of unions and ambivalent towards labor organizing. Furthermore, the UFW was affiliated with the AFL-CIO, whose leadership both supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam and did little to end discrimination in its ranks. And the UFW and the AFL-CIO was in conflict with the Teamsters, which was an ally of SCLC. So this common organizational practice, this common commitment to nonviolence wasn't enough to surpass all these other things that stood between these two organizations. And the fact that King and SCLC didn't support the UFW and didn't support the Grape boycott has lasting repercussions in that when SCLC attempts to organize the Poor People's Campaign, which brought poor people of various racial and ethnic backgrounds to Washington, D.C. to protest poverty, Chavez refused SCLC's repeated requests that the UFW participate. And not only that, he would not allow other UFW members to participate, even when they wanted to. But there was still an alliance, eventually, between SCLC and the UFW. But it's not with, as I said, everybody assumes this King-Chavez alliance. Really, that alliance happens when, after King is assassinated and his successor, Ralph Abernathy, becomes president of the SCLC. So in November of 1968, Abernathy declares that the that SCLC will support the Grape boycott. And this also demonstrates the importance of leadership in coalition building. It takes, coalition building is an incredibly personal endeavor. And you need to have that one leader, or to borrow another historian's phrase, I use the term bridge leader. You need to have that one leader who's going to say, look, we have our own cause. We certainly are under a lot of pressure here. But what this group over here is doing is really important. And it's really important for us to help them. And if you don't have that voice, that leadership, then the coalition it's just not going to happen naturally, right? You need that leader to make that happen. And for SCLC, that was Ralph Abernathy. A part of this shows to different types of leadership also, and that's the different types of men that King and Abernathy were. Abernathy had very personal reasons for wanting to support the UFW. So Abernathy, and this also connects to the issue of place in coalition building. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in urban Atlanta. SCLC was rooted in urban Atlanta, so the organization's focus was generally on urban issues. Abernathy, however, grew up in rural Alabama. His grandparents were sharecroppers. As a child, he picked cotton. So he very easily recognized the commonalities between what African-American sharecroppers in the Deep South and Mexican-American farm workers in California shared. So, but he also had some other, there's that personal feeling of connection rooted in place, the rural versus the urban, but he also had other motivations for supporting the UFW. By 1968, following King's assassination, SCLC had lost many supporters, and so Abernathy sought to improve the relationship between SCLC and organized labor. Abernathy was committed to continuing the fight for economic equality. That was the mission of the Poor People's Campaign. But he decided to do that by pursuing alliances with unions and ethnic minority groups. And this was a shift from SCLC's previous emphasis on obtaining the support of white liberals. So this reveals the importance of self-interest in coalition building, right? And in order to have a successful coalition, all sides need to benefit, right? There has to be something worthwhile in it for all sides. And so for SCLC, it becomes worthwhile to support the UFW because it would help strengthen the organization overall and provide a new base of allies for the SCLC, which again, as I said, SCLC was sorely lacking at this time. So Abernathy declares in numerous public statements, SCLC is supporting the UFW. He directs SCLC members and supporters to boycott grapes. Operation Breadbasket, which was a subsidiary of SCLC run by Jesse Jackson, followed SCLC's lead in supporting the grape boycott. Members and supporters boycotted California grapes and picketed stores in the Black community that stocked them. Operation Breadbasket support resulted in California grapes being pulled from the shelves of all Jewel grocery stores in the Chicago area. It basically, because of Operation Breadbasket, at one point it becomes basically impossible to buy grapes in Chicago. So, well, in part because of the support of Operation Breadbasket. So self-interest is important, but it's also common interest. Operation Breadbasket, in addition to following Abernathy's order, was also working out of a sense of common interest because the grocery stores that were persisting in selling California grapes had earlier been targets of Operation Breadbasket for discriminatory hiring practices. Right, so Operation Breadbasket and the UFW had a mutual enemy. It became easy for the two organizations to support each other's cause. Right, so the best example of these different factors that I've talked about this really comes together with the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the United Farm Workers. Here you see common interest, coalescing with class solidarity, interracial unity, geography, leadership, all come together in the case of the support that the Black Panther Party gives the United Farm Workers. Now, I realize that these two groups appear to be unlikely allies. The Black Panther Party was African American, militant, urban, socialist, and therefore differed in nearly every way from the largely Mexican American, nonviolent, rural, and Catholic UFW. But they overcame their differences to form a productive, mutually beneficial cross-racial alliance. So how did this happen? Well, one, from the party's founding in Oakland in 1966, it advocated multiracial solidarity. So this stemmed in part from the party leader's socialist ideology that class, not race, was what defined a group and its concerns. And so the party formed alliances with several progressive organizations, regardless of race. But the party was also motivated to pursue multiracial solidarity and coalitions due to the location of its founding, due to the racial and ethnic diversity of the Bay Area. Party members in Oakland grew up in the same neighborhoods as Latinos, Asian Americans, and American Indians, who shared their experiences of police brutality, unequal education, and discrimination in housing and employment. So Oakland's multiracial milieu led the party to prefer multiracial coalition building as a more practical and desirable strategy than the racial separatism called for by other advocates of Black power elsewhere in the United States. And one piece of evidence is actually quite simple, right? So other advocates of Black power of the era, notably folks like Stokely Carmichael, were proclaiming Black power. That was not the party slogan. I mean, they did say that on occasion, but the party slogan was all power to the people. And generally, if you heard, especially like Bobby Seale or Eldridge Cleaver speak, they would say all power to the people, but then they would go on. Black power to Black people, brown power to brown people, red power, and they'd start polka dot power to polka dot people. They would go on for this for like 5 minutes, naming every kind of person they could imagine. But again, the main slogan was all power to the people. And that shows that the inclusiveness and emphasis on multiracial solidarity typical of the Black freedom struggle in the Bay Area. So because of this awareness, this close knowledge of other racial and ethnic groups, the party understood African Americans and Mexican Americans as commonly oppressed peoples of color, subject to the same forces. So members of the Black Panther Party participated in rallies in support of the striking farm workers at the nearby University of California, Berkeley. They published regular updates on the Grape Boycott in its newspaper. And this was incredibly important because the Black Panther Party newspaper was published weekly, and this really becomes an educational vehicle because it's not only being purchased and read by Panthers, right? This is a newspaper that's being sold throughout the Black community, and then eventually it widens its scope and it's being purchased and read by pretty much anybody on the left, right? So They had regular updates on the Grape boycott, so it was a way for everyone in the community to learn about what was happening with the farm workers. Often they would maybe reprint articles from the UFW's own newspaper, El Malcriado. So it was really an informational tool. So they're both showing their support and bringing other people in to support the farm workers as well. So, okay, so they're formed in Oakland, California. This is hardly the fields. This is a very urban environment. And even though it's we're talking about California, it is still, the systems of oppression in this urban environment are different than these rural systems, right? But you have to remember that a lot of members of the Black Panther Party were migrants or children of migrants, in that they or their families had migrated to the Bay Area from the rural South, generally in the context of the Second Great Migration. So either, like founders Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they migrated from the rural South as children with their families. Others in the organization were descendants of migrants, right? So their parents had experience with farm labor, with rural systems of poverty and oppression. So La Causa resonated with the party because its members could relate to the struggles of rural agricultural workers. One of the best examples of this is Bobby Seale. So Bobby Seale migrates to Oakland from Texas as a child. So he migrates from an area already with a significant Latino agricultural worker population. Moves to Oakland, and his father was a carpenter. And one of the ways that Seale's father would supplement his income was that he bought an old bus. I can't remember if it was a school bus or an army bus, but he bought an old bus, and he basically became a labor contractor. So he would transport workers to the fields, and he would charge the workers, who were usually Mexican-American, he would charge them $1 a person. And then he would also charge the growers $1 a person. So he's making pretty good money. And so every once in a while, just to make some extra money, Bobby Seale and his siblings would go along and go, pick crops for a day. And Bobby said in one of his memoirs that he became very upset with his father. Because on days when the crops wasn't good, he didn't feel like his father should be charging these workers that $1. Right? He didn't like the way that his father was exploiting these workers. So he and his siblings and his mother all stood up to the father and demanded that his father not charge the workers so much, right? And so this was something that happened in his childhood. He grows up with this, with a recognition of the ways in which Mexican-American agricultural workers in California were being exploited, in this case by his own father, right? So despite the fact that he's in urban Oakland, he has a very early knowledge of what's happening in the fields of California. And so it's Seale who tells the party, we are supporting the farm workers, right? Going back to the importance of leadership. It is Seale who says this is going to happen. So, and again, part of this, part of this place, part of this is the Bay Area, the rural-urban connection. But again, part of it goes back to the ideology of the party, right? They're socialist. Seale and other party leaders conceived of the Panthers and the larger Black community as workers, as fundamentally as workers. So they felt a commonality with the struggle of the United Farm Workers for fair and equitable working conditions. So the party's support for the United Farm Workers escalated when the union began a secondary boycott of the Safeway grocery store chain, which was the largest buyer of California grapes next to the US Department of Defense. So Safeway annually brought California grapes totaling, and this is just from Jamura, about $1 million in sales. So in addition, most of Safeway's directors served as the heads of large agribusiness corporations. So this was a golden opportunity because the party had its own reason for targeting Safeway. And that's that Safeway refused to donate to the Free Breakfast for Children program. So the party, actually this was Seale's idea, the party developed the Free Breakfast for Children program to combat academic underachievement among poor, hungry children. Basically, if you send a kid to school hungry, they can't concentrate, they're not to do well in school. So the party starts a free breakfast program. It served a hot, nutritious breakfast to 20,000 school-age children in 19 cities every day. And they did this by depending, one, on the volunteers, members of the party, and people in the community who would come and cook and serve the food to the children. But they also depended on the donations of local stores and businesses. If those stores refused to donate, they could either donate supplies or they could donate money. If they refused to donate either, then the Panthers would publish in their newspaper a list of stores who wouldn't donate and call on people to boycott those stores. So when the UFW decides to target Safeway, it's perfect. It's, light coming down from the heavens. It's this perfect coalescing of common interests. So they combine forces. They make these two different boycotts of Safeway into one. Panthers participated in picket lines alongside farm workers in front of Safeway stores. And the intimidating Panther presence deterred police harassment of the picketing farm workers. But even beyond that, Seale had an amazing idea. Seale, like many other of the party leaders, he was a veteran. And one of the things he had learned in the military, Seale worked in the motor pool. So he formed a motor pool for party use. And so what he did, in the case of Safeway, is that they would in the afternoon or in the evening when people were coming to grocery shop after work, they would get kids in the community to do the picket. And then the Panthers, as people were approaching the store, they would say, please don't shop here. They're selling California grapes. They won't donate to the Free Breakfast for Children program. We have a car right here. We will drive you to Lucky grocery stores. We will wait for you, and then we will drive you home so that you don't have to carry all your groceries. This was so effective that they actually shut down a Safeway store in West Oakland within a matter of a couple of days. Right? So this coalition building has very real effects. And then the UFW returns the favor in the ways that it can. So when the Panthers become the targets of oppression by law enforcement, the targets of violence, the UFW voices their support for the parties in very outspoken ways. So this coalition, this coalition building across the Black freedom struggle, this willingness of all these different organizations to support the UFW, to support the Grape boycott, contributed to the UFW's eventual victory. These kinds of coalitions, especially the dramatic things like you see with Safeway, keeps the UFW and the Grape boycott in the national spotlight, and it takes a mounting toll on California's table grape growers. And furthermore, the secondary boycott tactic of boycotting grocery stores that sold California grapes was incredibly financially damaging, and the one that really proved to be the final straw for the growers. So the first contracts with the UFW were signed in 1970, making it the first union contracts for agricultural workers in the United States, and thus ended the Grape boycott. But as I said, the level of support, even though all these organizations helped to bring about the end of the Grape boycott, and the UFW's victory, for all these organizations, the level of support varied according to their class orientation, their historic relationship with organized labor, their politics, and their knowledge of Mexican-American issues due to geographic proximity. And again, the importance of leadership, right? For the NAACP, Leonard H. Carter had to take the lead. For SCLC, it was Abernathy. For the party, it was Seale. It always took someone to say, this is what we need to do. So what I hope to show, or what I hope I've been showing, is that even when working with allies makes practical sense, coalition building is a complicated, difficult undertaking. And that cross-racial coalition building depends on much more than race and a sense of cross-racial solidarity. But that ultimately, when groups are able to cross those divides and find common cause, that they can be successful. Thank you.